to be the shortest guy that I know. And I said, no, there's one other person shorter than me. And then this person also, I used to be really fast and junk like that, and I was always faster than one person. I always made sure that if I was going to race, there was one person I was going to beat. And then there was other things, like chasing girls. I was going to get the first girlfriend, he was going to get the second girlfriend, like leftovers and
I
stuff.
beat both of you, yeah.
And I was first in law enforcement. Now Lindon has followed my footsteps in law enforcement. And I just want you to know that everything is, if you're not first, you're last. Well, I spoke first. Lindon's going to speak first.
The king of exaggeration, Jimmy Cash. I heard a story this week I wanted to share with you. It had to do with little Billy Scott. It seems like one day little Billy Scott came home and he was crying and he was all upset and he was just beside himself. He was hugging on his mom. Mom, the other kids are making fun of me. They want to pick on me. Nobody likes me. Nobody's my friend. So she said, I tell you what, you go in your room, I'm going to have your dad come in there. When he gets home, Dad came in, talked to little Billy, came in and told his mom. He said, yeah, he's really upset. He said, I don't know what to do. And she said, if he just quit wearing that damn Purdue t-shirt around the neighborhood, they'd quit picking on him. How have they done in the tournament this year? I'm not paying my mom told you back then they'd never win a championship. You just didn't listen. Jimmy here, he was talking some stories. I remember one day not long ago, speaking of the Scott family, Jim and I were visiting. Poor lady lost her husband, a little widow lady, and Jimmy is a real humanitarian. What Jimmy did is I saw him, go up. He was hugging this lady, trying to console her, and I was standing kind of right behind him. I walked up just in time to hear him say, if you're wanting to downsize, I've got a 1.5 bath, 2-bedroom home downtown here. So Jimmy really looks out for his fellow man. And one other story I got to share with Jimmy. True story, I'm not making this up. This happened back, he was talking about our days of chasing women. I actually caught some, but Jimmy told me one night he had gone over to a bar in Louisville. And he met this real pretty little girl, and Jimmy's kind of a BS artist sometimes. And so I said, well, how'd it go? He said, well, it was real good. She was real cute. I asked her name. She told me her name. She said she was from an Italian family. And then she asked him his name. He said, I told her Jimmy Casciarelli. Although she didn't go home with him. And I don't know, there's a couple of things I'll tell you about myself. I think Jimmy invited me here. Some people in the room know. Is there anybody in the room that has never read a column I've written? Just raise your hand, be honest. Is there anybody? So most of you probably know that I write for the local paper. I also, as he pointed out, for almost 2.5 years, I've been the court liaison officer for the Clark County Sheriff's Department, which means I deal with all kind of prosecutor, lawyer, public defender issues, a lot of jail problems. So basically, I describe that as I do everything that's on the sheriff or director's desk, but it's kind of beneath their dignity to do. They throw it in my pile. So I've had a lot of experience in the community in different aspects. I thought I really knew the community after writing the column for what the first Saturday in May will mark the end of 19 full years I've been writing the column. So I'll be starting my 20th year in May. And then I've worked down at the jail for really 2 years and 4 months, and I think I know way more about the community than I ever wanted to know from that position. So later on we'll be doing a Q&A. If you have any questions along those lines, I'll be happy to discuss that as well. As far as my writing career, I started probably about 23 years ago with Marilyn Street Young over at the New Albany Tribune. She was needing some freelance writers to do feature stories and things just kind of away from the news that they put in the newspaper, human interest stories. So she gave me my first opportunity to write, and I really had no idea how to write a newspaper story. So the very first story I went out on, a friend where my wife works, her son was in Special Forces, and this was over during Desert Storm. And she said he was coming home and they were having a big reception in Clarksville. He was kind of a local hero for, going out and being in battle. And I went there with this preconceived notion that this is the story I was going to write about, a local boy going off to war, returning home, pretty standard fare. But when he walked in, he had this really pretty young girl with him. And I sat down and was talking to him. And she had actually been a civilian employee that had gone over with the Special Forces before they did their invasion. And she was teaching them some kind of top secret information, whatever she was representing the government for in a civilian role. And they had about 2 weeks of class. And he was a really good looking, kind of a stud ranger kind of guy, and she was a very pretty young lady. So as the course of normal events took place, they kind of got spit with each other. Although neither one kind of had the nerve or whatever to tell the other. Well, the day came when they were going to pull out, and it was like an old romantic war movie. The bus is pulling out, he's on the bus, he's going off to war. She didn't get to tell him how she felt. And literally as the bus is pulling off, she runs up, the driver opens the door, he runs off, they kiss each other, say they love each other, he goes to war. And actually on the reunion coming back, he had just come back from war, and these two this was really the first time he introduced her to the family and the community. And the lesson that I learned from that day is that everybody has a story, and whenever I go to talk to somebody or want to write about somebody, I don't want it to be what I want to write. I want it to be what they want to tell me, what story they have. And I still contend after 19 years, anybody can have a good story. And the thing is, you don't think your story is good, but your story is unique, because all of us have a unique life. And what you think is mundane or just what you've lived, it's a real story to somebody else. So that kind of got me hooked. And then Tom Lindley, could you have me my iced tea over there, please? I need a drink. If you know who Tom Lindley is, he came back from an illustrious career down south in Alabama. And Tom became the publisher editor of the Evening News. And I had known Tom because Jack and I were on Little League teams together, his brother. And Tom started off as a cub reporter at Evening News, went off and had this really, really good journalism career. And his dream was always come back and be the editor and publisher of the newspaper. So I met him for lunch, told him I wanted to write a column. And when we started off, it was going to be a rotating once-a-month column. We were going to have Dick Wathen, who was state representative, was going to do a week. Can't remember, it was the guy that was the head of the hospital board back then. I'm drawing a blank on his name. And the chancellor out at IUS and myself were going to be the 4 contributors. And I sent in one column, and I haven't missed a week since the first one I sent in. So, like I said, I'll be starting on my 20th year. And not only do I need to thank Tom Lindley, I need to thank Maryland Street Young at the Tribune for getting me started. And another guy who did amazing things for me personally was Bob Hill. And I don't know if you all have had Bob here or know Bob, but Bob is one of the class acts that has ever been not only in the newspaper business, but just as a human being. One day I was working in the corporate world, I get a call. And it was called from the Evening News that I was going to be on that I'd been invited to be on the State of Affairs public radio show. And of course, I was pretty excited because I was a young writer then, hadn't done a whole lot. I've been writing a few years. And they said, you're going to be on with Bob Hill and Dick Desruzzo. And I don't know how many of you remember Dick, but he did a lot of humor writing for the Courier, did some column work. Basically, I was on with 2 Hall of Fame writers, and then there was me. And the one thing I'll never forget about Dick and Bob is I show up, a little local guy here at the Evening News, and they treated me just like a colleague. Bob and I became friends, and when we were in there on the radio show, they made sure that I didn't get squeezed out because they were big city writers, and I was a little kid over across the river. And then after that, I did find out Bob Hill had recommended me for the gig, and he said he had read the column and recommended me to talk about Southern Indiana. So I owe Bob Hill a great debt of gratitude for giving me credibility there. Past getting started, I just thought I would share a few stories of some things, some opportunities I've had in life. Back in 2000, I was chosen by the local Rotary International, well, it was club here, it was a statewide representative, representatives that I went to India to represent Southern Indiana, really the whole state of Indiana, but I was the Southern Indiana representative. And when you travel abroad with Rotary, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Rotary International. Rotary International is the one that puts clean water over in these third world countries. They build the schools, and they do just marvelous things. And when you walk around India with a blue jacket with a Rotary seal, we basically got the same trip as a congressman or somebody really important would get. We were very well received. And it was an opportunity of a lifetime for a little kid from Oak Park in Jeffersonville to represent the United States all around northern India while I was there. And I remember one particular evening, I was the guest of a guy that was a kind of a world famous scientist researcher. And some of you guys probably remember back when something called Taxol was around, and they thought Taxol was the next cancer cure. And the gentleman I stayed with, he was one of the leading world researchers in the Taxol research. So I happened to be there when they were having a festival. And it was a little river town, much like Jeffersonville, really. It was right up on the river, and it was a very small community. Of course, over there was kind of relative, because I stayed in Amritsar the first night. And I asked the guy there, I said, how many people live in Amritsar, India? He said, well, we're just a small town. We only have 8 million people here. And that's the way it is. If you've never traveled to a place like India, or I'm sure China's the same way, you know, you got a place that's 2/3 the size of the state of Texas and have 1.2 billion people living there. So you don't see a lot of places. If you get anywhere near a city, it's like people, like an ant colony. And that's just the way it was everywhere you went. So anyway, I'm in this nice little community, staying with this scientist. And if you know anything about India, you know one thing: they don't eat meat. You don't find hamburgers, you don't find meat anywhere in India. So he had invited me to eat dinner that night before we went out to this little festival they were having. And he said, you're very fortunate. We only have this festival 1 week a year, and you're here at the great time. And he said, we fixed a special dish. So he serves me this dish. And there's something resembling meat in here. And I'm eating it up, because all I've had is casserole vegetable dishes. So I finished the first one, and I didn't want to seem too forward, but I said, you know, I'm kind of hungry, would you mind? Would it be too bold if I could ask for a second dish? He gladly gave me, he had a great big pot, you know. So I'm sitting here eating this second dish, and curiosity got the better of me, and I said, I got to ask you, I said, what is it we've been eating? That tastes really good. He said, well, the first thing we do is we take the stomach out of the goat, we lay it on the ground, we dry it out, we chop it into little pieces, and we make a stew. So I was eating goat gut stew. Oh. And after I found out it was goat gut stew, that second bowl didn't go down near as fast. But then one of the experiences of my lifetime, and Jimmy will tell you, I mean, he doesn't like to admit that I'm a bigger daredevil. I've always done some crazy things in my life, but one of the craziest things I ever did was fly from one city to the other on India Air. India Air is nothing like what we have here, or it wasn't in 2000. First of all, if you remember the show Green Acres and the Hooterville Airlines, if you remember the Hooterville Airlines, that was exactly in real life what India Air was. I mean, literally short of tying the rope around your waist, everything else was Hooterville Airlines. In fact, when the lady came and she wanted to know if we wanted lunch, you know, we get the nice prepackaged things on the American Airlines. She brought a sandwich that looked like she made it in her kitchen. And of course, if you know anything about eating food in foreign countries and drinking liquids in foreign countries, you're very careful. But I remember distinctly sitting on the plane. We're flying, it's about a 2-hour flight. And those of us who remember the old 6 and 8 cylinder vehicles where you could like sit in the trunk and work on them and change your spark plugs. If you remember when you had a plug wire or two gone bad on one of the old engines and how that engine would cut in and out and you didn't know if you were going to get home, that was what my plane did for 2 hours. And I swore to the guy next to me, if we get to that next airport, I'll hitchhike, I'll ride a camel or donkey wagon, I will never fly another India Airlines airplane. To get to some of the things about writing, and I get asked a lot of questions about writing. And one of the things that took me a while to figure out was not everybody can write. it's like every gentleman out here, every lady out here, you have a talent, whether it's you're a good cook or whether you were an engineer or whatever you've done in your life, you have a talent. And not everybody has that talent. So I took it for granted a long time. When I turned 40, I was getting ready to turn 40, I had a son. I only had one child. And I had always wanted to ask to write a column, and I told Kim, I said, if I'm going to tell my son, you can do anything you want in life. You can pursue any dream you want in life. I've sat here and I've wanted to do this for so long. So if I'm going to be true to tell him that he needs to do his dreams, that's what I'm going to do. So when I started writing, I was almost 40 years old when I started writing a column. And one of the things I've always said is any success I've had has been because of one simple reason. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing the first week. And I still don't know, really, when people say, how do you do it, or what's your formula? I can't tell you. I just sit down and write. I was doing a seminar at the library one time, and it was a bunch of aspiring writers. And a gentleman asked me that when you write your weekly column, do you write it for your audience out there, or do you write it for yourself? And I had never consciously thought, that was a point I had never even considered. But I thought a moment and I said, well, I don't think you can write for the audience. Because if I want to write for what I think somebody wants to read, that's not going to be my thoughts. That's not going to be my honest thoughts and what's coming out of me. So I don't think you could do that and do this for 19 years on a weekly basis. If I say any characteristic of my writing in general is I'm honest. And sometimes I'm honest to a fault. And honesty doesn't always make you friends. In Clark County, there's several different things that I've written about my family, which at first when I started writing about my family, I thought maybe it was vain, or maybe you're kind of making yourself something as an example. But especially when my son was young and I wrote about him, I found out that was universal. Anything you write about that somebody can relate to, they're going to like. And one of my greatest stories of Cameron, when he was about 5 or 6, we were up here at Save-A-Lot Grocery at Mill Road and Allison Lane. And my son is painfully shy. He always has been. He's better now at 19, but when he was 5 or 6, it would just kill him when I made him look in the eyes when we would meet somebody and stick up his little hand and shake their hand and introduce himself. He hated that. So we're standing there in line, and there's this little sweet lady behind us. She's probably an 80-year-old lady, And Cameron I noticed him looking at the candy. Well, he knew he didn't ask for candy. That was just not allowed. But I just saw him quietly looking, and I said, Cameron, you can go ahead and have a candy bar. As soon as I said Cameron, this little sweet lady behind us, she said, is that by any chance that sweet little Cameron I've been reading about for about 5 years in the paper? And I said, yes, ma'am, it is. Of course, I did the torture of making him turn around and introduce himself. And she said some nice things. Well, we paid and left. And it was dark. We're riding home. He's in the back of the minivan. He said, Dad, I've been doing a lot of thinking. I said, okay, son. He said, I've decided I don't want to be a celebrity anymore. Tom Lindley used to always joke and tell me that when your son grows up and starts to read a newspaper, your writing career will be over, because kids, as you all know, everybody in this room, I suspect, has been a parent or a grandparent, and there's no more entertaining stories that you can tell than from the honesty that comes out of a kid's mouth. He gave me more material week after week. Then another thing that I'm kind of known for, which is kind of odd, but a lot of people think I'm kind of a political writer. And I've gone back before to year and count. In some years I might have written out of 52 weeks, 5 or 6 political columns, maybe as many on a bad year, maybe 8 or 9. But a couple things I've done. One is I do a lot of political satire. I don't do as much as I used to. I did a lot more. And people remember those. And most people like those except for the people that you're naming that you're doing satire about. So that's where I come in with the honesty part, that I've had a lot of politicians be very upset because they can't take a joke. And the politicians that I've really, really respected over the years are ones that I could satirize or make fun of, and when I'd see them, they understood. Tom Galligan, does anybody in here not know who Tommy Galligan is, first of all? Tommy Galligan